Welcome everyone to this webinar on out-of-court resolutions for higher harm crimes. Really pleased to see you. I'm Fionnuala, Ratcliffe, Deputy Director at Transform Justice. I'm here with Penelope, Director of Transform Justice, and Courtney, our Communications Officer. Really this afternoon. In terms of this next hour, we're going to be talking about out-of-court resolutions for higher harm crimes. So obviously all police forces use out-of-court resolutions for crimes such as criminal damage, theft, drug possession. But when it comes to some more sensitive crimes such as domestic abuse or hate crime or assaults on emergency workers, there is some reticence to use anything but the toughest option, a concern that anything but prosecution sends a message to victims and to the person who did it that the harm caused is not being taken seriously. What we want to ask is, by assuming that court is best in these cases, are we missing opportunities to provide a better resolution for victims, or even to be more effective in how we support people to change their behaviour and rehabilitate? That's what we want to explore today. With a bit of a whistle-stop tour of crime types and police forces, as we hear some ways that these delicate areas are being navigated with some good results. In terms of the setup, this is a webinar, so we're going to hear from fantastic speakers, and then we're going to open it up for questions at the end. Attendees are muted and your cameras are off. So use the Q&A function to ask questions, and you can also vote for other people's questions there if you think it's a really good one and you want it to be asked. Not everyone can, there's sometimes problems with the Q&A, so if you have any issues, do use the chat instead, and we'll pick up questions there. Courtney and I will be keeping a look on it, keeping an eye on it. What else? I'll be timekeeping. Also feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves and share any reflections. We're recording this webinar, and so we can send a link round afterwards for anyone who's signed up but has missed it. To kick us off, I'm going to hand over straight away to Penelope, who's going to have a conversation with Ailsa Quinn from Surrey Police about how they introduced a deferred prosecution option for women accused of intimate partner abuse. Over to you and Ailsa. Okay.
Hi Ailsa, great to have you here. Some people on the call might not be so clear about deferred prosecution, and I know that you've run a deferred prosecution scheme called Checkpoint for a long time. Before we go specifically to domestic abuse, can you just kind of give us a brief outline of how the Checkpoint scheme works overall in Surrey?
Sure. So we borrowed with pride from Durham. We went up there and visited them, and basically we took the scheme on as a whole. So we have the same sort of eligibility as them. We have a central hub model in Surrey. I have 10 navigators who are the caseworkers. I have a specialist navigator who works with the Women's Centre, and one who works from a charity specialising in homelessness. We do a needs assessment. We listen to the voice of the victim. We then create conditions that are part of the Checkpoint agreement that are agreed with the offender. And then we work with them over a minimum of 3 weeks, sometimes 4 months, sometimes a slightly longer. And at the end of that, they will get an outcome 22 if they successfully complete it. If they don't, it's returned to the officer for a more formal outcome, which includes prosecution. I also just say we also have Checkpoint Plus, which is a sort of additional part of it, which has enhanced eligibility. And so we can take people with multiple previous convictions, and they can have had more than one checkpoint in 12 months. And the people who are eligible for that are women offenders, care leavers, and men with 3 or 4 disadvantages. So that's homelessness, drink problem, drug problem, or mental health problem. So that's kind of how we run it.
So as in the Durham model, presumably nobody on Checkpoint has to formally admit the offence, but they can't outright deny it, and they they have the sort of sword of Damocles of prosecution if they don't complete the program that you offer them.
That's correct.
Right, that's great. So why did you want to extend Checkpoint to women accused of intimate partner abuse? Presumably, we're not talking about great numbers here.
No, we've had hundreds through now, and I'll go through that at the end when I talk about our results, but we've had hundreds through. So no, the numbers are relatively low. I'd say we probably get sort of 4 or 5 a month that come through, because we take sort of standard, medium and higher risk. We did it because we originally, back in 2016, we had a women's justice intervention. So that was before Checkpoint, and we built up a relationship with our women's support centre in Surrey. And so we'd already started working specifically with women, and realised, as we all know, that women commit offences for very different reasons. And certainly when it comes to domestic abuse, they are also often victims as well. And so rather than criminalise them, we wanted to give them an opportunity, if we could deal with them as a part of a deferred prosecution scheme.
So here we're talking about things like common assault, criminal damage, verbal abuse, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and harassment, stalking, but without any violence, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the actual program, the intervention, what do you do with the women?
First of all, just to say, with higher risk offences, we have a joint decision making panel that's once a week. So, and on that panel, I chair it. I have another police colleague, and then we also have our liaison on diversion. We have adult social care and the women's centre, so that we can hear the background to the women and who else is already working with them, and we hear the voice of the victim, so I can risk assess whether it is actually suitable, because obviously we don't want to take something on if actually the risk is too high. And that actual panel, we also take in our hate crime, assault emergency workers and weapon offences. Just thought I'd say that as well. So we always use a female navigator, usually with the Women's Centre. The Women's Centre obviously gives us...
So can you just explain what the role of the navigator?
So the navigator is the caseworker. So they are responsible. They will meet the woman. They will then do an in-depth needs assessment to work out, and we ask them to score what they think the reasons are for their offending. So we'll go through the whole sort of relationships, drink, drug, money, housing, relationship, all of that kind of thing. We then sort out what they need support with. And then we speak to the victim as well, in case they need anything from the scheme, and that's how we work out our conditions. And then they will work with, support, keep contact with the woman all the way through. They might be going on courses, for example. Just make sure you've got your course starts tomorrow. Make sure you attend that. Are you doing this? Are you doing that? How are you doing? And they follow them and support them all the way through to the end.
And when you say they're there, but do they then do what kind of courses? What do they interact with the Women's Centre?
Yeah, so we will have normal courses. So, for example, you might have problems with debt. The lady might have problems with debt, or housing, or drink, or drugs. And so we have other normal interventions that we would have with our other offenders. And then I have to say it's progressed through the time that we've had Checkpoint. And we're now working with a local provider who run a healthy relationships course, which is a 10-week course, very intensive, one-to-one. And in parallel with that, we run that with one that includes the person who leads it works for the local domestic abuse outreach service. So where we have a woman who is also a victim, they will do that course. And then it's very, very much sort of the trauma informed, working with them as a victim, making sure not only do they not reoffend, but actually making sure that they're okay and helping them through their story, as it were.
That sounds great. I mean, going backwards to introducing this deferred prosecution for intimate partner abuse, what kind of reaction did you get locally to the idea?
So I've been really lucky. So I've had Gavin Stevens, who is now chair of the NPCC, as my superintendent all the way through to chief constable. And back in 2011, we started a deferred prosecution for young people. And then he pushed for the women's justice, and then he asked me to start Checkpoint. So I've had support from the very top all the way, and I've been really, really lucky with that. And I've also had support from our DA lead in force. We actually got some resistance from our DA outreach, the charities that's in Surrey, and they were quite against it actually. And I think some of it was due to sort of the fear of the risk. Some of it was feeling that we weren't dealing with domestic abuse seriously enough. But I think one of their biggest fears was this was a bit of a creep, and eventually we would allow men into this, and this was something that they were really, really against. So yeah, I had to work with them to try and sort of win them round, as it were.
And how did you win them round?
So we had a meeting with the CEOs, and basically I actually took real life cases, and when they hear the actual real life cases, I think lots of people, when they think of domestic abuse, it's all fists and punching and violence and that sort of thing, but often it's the damage, it's what's led up to it. And when you actually hear the detail of the actual cases, they were sort of, okay, well, I can kind of see how that might work. But then what we then decided was we'd start it, but actually they would sit with me on the joint decision-making panel, and they would sort of scrutinise it and make the decisions with me. And we were going to do that for 6 months, but actually after 3 months, they were satisfied that actually we was, the rigours were there, the hearing the victim, hearing the background to the women, how we made the decisions, how we assessed risk. They were happy with all of that, and so they let us carry that on. And then we had sort of quarterly meetings with them and other partners, including people like the Women's Centre, but had CPS, courts, probation, were all on there just to hear how we were getting on and making sure that they thought it was safe as well.
That sounds pretty thorough. In terms of the impact of the programme, have you got any metrics on the impact?
Yes, I have. So I write quarterly reports. I keep my own records. So we've actually had 249 female intimate domestic abuse offenders come through Checkpoint. Out of those 249, after a year, we then went back to check reoffending, and only 11 of those have reoffended. So that's a reoffending rate of 4.4%. And then after 2 years, so that's that's 159 cases have been completed, and then look 2 years ahead, 4 of those had reoffended. What we also do is we get them to rate their issues at the beginning out of 10, and then rate it at the end after we've done our interventions. And so we can also track that actually we're making an impact on the parts of their lives that they've said are the most, why they committed offences in the first place. So we do that as an ongoing thing as well. And then we also ask them to, we don't ask them to, they do statements of reflection. Obviously we don't do RJ for domestic abuse, but then we also get lots of letters in. We get this week there's a bunch of flowers in the office at the moment from an offender after we've worked with her, because it changes their lives. They get the support that they've been trying to get, especially with mental health and alcohol problems for years, and they haven't managed to get that help, and that's what Checkpoint does. It supports them and helps them with that.
So in the end, you haven't prosecuted hardly any of the ones who've been through the programme?
No. We do get some non-engagements. I'm not saying it's perfect, and sometimes women aren't in the right place, but generally most of them manage to get through it, the vast majority of them.
Great, thanks very much for that, and I'll hand back to Fionnuala.
Thank you, Penelope. Thanks so much, Ailsa. Do post questions in the chat, everyone, for Ailsa about the Checkpoint programme and how they've made it work in Surrey. We're going to move on now to a different topic. Sarah Carlsen-Browne from Devon, Cornwall and Cornwall Police is going to talk about their out-of-court resolution for assaults on emergency workers. Hi, Sarah. I'm going to share your slides. So just one moment whilst I do that.
And apologies, everyone. I've got a bit of a chest infection, so if I cough during it, just excuse me. Right. It's rightly an emotional issue, assault on emergency workers. And we were very aware right from the beginning that we wanted to have a really robust offer in our deferred prosecution scheme around assault on emergency workers. And it's important to say that our AEW workshop sits within bespoke contracts, very much like Ailsa's described, which have a set of conditions and obviously have key workers, very much similar to the navigators that work with these individuals. But we were acutely aware that we wanted something really tangible and really robust that looked at the whole area of anger management, was a platform for really exploring the impact of assault on emergency workers, and was also a vehicle to really open up conversations around restorative justice, parallel to what they were having to do around their contracts. So why did we do this? Well, as I've said, it's a very emotional issue. And when you talk to officers or other services, nobody seems particularly happy or satisfied with the outcomes. And actually, there's no real behaviour change happening in terms of really addressing that. And all people who go through a behaviour change programme, if it's non-judgmental, if it's actually something where they're learning and fun, just like in business, they tend to tell other people around what they've learnt. And it really works in terms of that almost relationship management of telling others around it. We felt that as a force, we were letting down maybe officers as victims, and it was really important that we bulked up around our offer. And we wanted to change that kind of culture around our J, particularly with officers and staff and other services, where it's seen and misunderstood in terms of what it offers and what it provides. So I thought it might be useful to share how did we go about this. So we went to the Officer Safety Board, where partners sit as well, and proposed that we would start a workshop with nil cost, because we have the skills and experience within our teams to create content and create schemes of work and to be facilitators. And we asked for their support around doing so. So a partnership was created across Fire Service, South West Ambulance, who've been really, really supportive in this, and I thank them for that, NHS and wider partners, in order to co-produce the content and the schemes of work for the course. It separates into three distinct areas. So one is very much around kind of understanding anger, understanding the triggers of anger, understanding how you can de-escalate from that, understanding the impact of substance misuse, which is often a factor within these offences, and understanding and learning and teaching techniques to de-escalate and to manage that. So there is a preventative side to this as well. And so we will incorporate people from our deferred prosecution scheme who also are people that the assessments of needs and the assessment of risk have identified. Do you know what? They're probably somebody who might do this at some stage. And that's been something which has been really welcomed by that cohort as well. So the anger management bit very much focuses on all the skills and the practical things they need to know, and it moves them in a non-judgmental way through the group dynamic to having conversations about what happened and accepting responsibility. Because you will often hear when you work with people who've committed an AEW at this level of offence, well, yeah, I did do it, but actually they did this or they did that. And there's this kind of minimisation that goes on. So it's really important that we start to actually tackle that. The second bit looks very much at explaining things, which we forget because we work in it. The general public perhaps don't really understand. So that's the definition of what an emergency worker is. It's also really exploring the consequences of their actions, what the law says, what would be the impact of future reoffending, and really breaks down into both the individual cost, the impact on people's families, their loved ones, their colleagues, the organisation, and the societal cost. So really looking at details about how much it costs if, for example, an ambulance is taken off the road, and explores that through the window of when have they actually needed help, when have their family or people they know relied on help, what's been the impact of maybe waiting for that help. And we use lots of videos and testimonials and really impactful kind of emotional sort of tools that are readily available to explore that then through a discussion. And then the final section is very much looking at restorative justice. And really breaking down some of the misunderstandings around that and some of the kind of lip service sort of apologies that officers and others in emergency services get, and really drilling down through the co-facilitation with the RJ coordinator about what it actually is, and sharing a video from an officer who's gone through an RJ process with somebody that was intent on causing him harm, and what was the benefits of that, both in terms of the person who caused that harm and for them in terms of repairing the harm and feeling that they could return to work. So it's got 3 distinct areas. And if we move on to the other slide, you'll see that the feedback has been incredibly positive, and it shows things like, for example, on the other slide, if we can get it up, Fionnuala, I don't know if it's working on that.
Yeah, 1 second.
Thank you. It shows essentially, you know, that we're tapping in, and you need to tap in to how people actually feel and respond for them to really face the impact of what they have done and work through that so they don't do it again. So that's through the videos, that's through getting them to understand the level and intensity of the volume of amount of assault and emergency workers. So often you can just say, oh, well, it was just me, but actually what does that look like in terms of the impact across all the services? Getting them to think about how they de-escalate if they get into that situation again. But doing so in a place where actually the group dynamic works, because people start calling each other out and having interesting conversations and challenging each other, but doing so in a non-judgmental and approachable way. We've run 5 workshops so far. They've been really positive. As I said, nil cost. So, you know, facilitation with key workers, with South West Ambulance, fire service, obviously have lots of venues. We've even linked up with the private sector and Santander for venues. So this is all nil cost. And because this sits within a wider package that the key worker is managing around that contract, there's really good attendance because we are doing that pre-work with somebody, making sure they attend. If somebody's very nervous, there's a lesson in itself around sitting in a group dynamic so the key worker can actually support that, and really helping again in terms of safeguarding and signposting back to the individual key worker, so there can be a debrief and they can be picking up themes, etc., as we go forwards. It is a tight eligibility. It is only for those assault and emergency workers that are deemed suitable for an out-of-court resolution, so a deferred charge in the main. But it is something which we see is really robust, and the feedback, also the feedback loop going back to the person who's been harmed, is something that is really, really appreciated as well. And we're hoping to expand this because as a model, we see that having that centralised model, reaching out to communities and pulling in resource, is something where we can morph and flex and establish different ways of working. So this is our first kind of in-house, out-house model, and we'll be looking to do that across different areas, because individual work is important, but actually group work is really important as well, because you get sometimes a truer picture of what happened in those circumstances. And it's also a platform for lots of our people who are vulnerable and isolated to actually start thinking about the possibility of engaging in different kind of group dynamics if we're looking, for example, at things like employment, education and training. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Sarah. That was brilliant. So everyone do add questions via the Q&A if you've got any questions for Sarah or for Ailsa so far, and we'll come to them after our third and final speaker, who is Elaine Knibbs from Rise Mutual, who's going to talk about Rise Mutual's out-of-court resolution intervention for hate crime. Penelope's going to have a chat with her. Over to you, Penelope and Elaine.
Hi, Elaine.
Hello.
Great to see you. Great to see you. And just to clarify, Rise Mutual is a not-for-profit company, isn't it, which does sort of courses for people who've got into trouble with the law, basically.
Yeah, I think I know quite a few of the names in this call. I've had a look at the register. So we provide some of our interventions. We've got quite a few interventions that we deliver as out-of-court resolutions, including actually assault and emergency workers and domestic abuse one as well. So, and some of the people that we work with are in the call. So hello to everyone as well.
That's great. So there was a decision way back to do a pilot for a conditional caution for hate crime. Yeah. And you worked with three forces, Avon and Somerset, West Mids and Hampshire, to run that conditional caution programme. So, you know, when you looked at this intervention and you were referred people, was the profile of the people who were referred to you for this intervention what you were actually expecting?
No, so a lot of work was done, obviously the same as with any course, a lot of work's done and research and working with the experts and the different police forces and outside people. And we expected we didn't really quite know what to expect. And we know there's a lot of controversy around giving out-of-court resolutions to these type of offences. And we were expecting people to have quite entrenched views, or at least some people to have quite entrenched views or problematic beliefs, to be quite, you know, maybe have some sort of real racist or homophobic or other attitudes. And what we found quite early on and quite quickly is that we do get some like that, but most of the service users that we get and the offenders we get are not people that carry those really entrenched views at all. And they are people which often state that they feel very guilty, a lot of remorse, a lot of shame about what they've done, a lot of disbelief, and a lot of them were drunk, which I know is not necessarily an excuse. It's, you know, in fact, it could make things a lot riskier. But a lot of them were drunk. A lot of them were in altercations, in either ongoing conflict with neighbours, ex-friends. We get quite a lot of people that are here for arguments with ex-friends or other family members, and a huge amount of people are here because of things that they've said during arrest. So with the police, particularly if they're being searched and the police officers try and put hands in their pockets, they're using homophobic words, you know, what's wrong with you? Are you gay? And this sort of stuff. So, and they get a lot of people through like that as well. So we've had to respond, and we adapted the way that we deliver some of the sessions to still target so it gets everyone's needs, and we've done a lot more research into it. And we've been doing it for a few years now. It was evaluated. The evaluation was extremely positive. Only 0.9% of people have had further contact with the police after doing the course, reoffended. So that's less than 1%, which is great. So we know it works, but yeah, the people are nothing like what we expected, or most of them are not like what we expected.
But you did have a bit of a challenge getting referrals, didn't you? Because what were the barriers there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of barriers, obviously, to do with getting other people's approval and getting a lot of the forces, like the three forces that we were working with, had to get approval for each case to send it to us to get an out-of-court resolution, and instead of taking it to court from people like the CPS or their seniors. And I think it's fair to say that not everybody was completely on board with giving out of court resolutions to a hate crime offence, regardless of the context around it. But what we've found is it works really well to work with the context around it rather than just the offence as well. And I think that's why it's so successful. But the pilot evaluation helped with that, because once that came out and there was evidence to show that what we're doing works, it's really effective, then I think people are a lot more on board with it now.
So going back to the offences, you're mainly talking about single incidents of some kind of verbal abuse.
Yeah, that's the type of people we get. I guess anyone more than that, rightly so, would get charged and go to court and things. So we are only dealing with isolated incidents. There's often a lot of context around the build-up that got there. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes it's drunken. There's a lot of people that we get like in nightclubs or with bouncers when getting thrown out, or police officers. So they're sort of isolated incidents. But we also get quite a lot where there's a lot of context and build-up, and it's come to a boiling point. And when we work with the group member and we talk to them about the situation, and they're saying, sometimes they say, I wanted to say the most despicable thing possible. I wanted to hurt this person and I couldn't think of anything worse to say. We always hear, you know, I found something which described them and I found something offensive and I went there and I feel really ashamed about that, but I wanted the impact that it had because I had so much hatred for that person at the moment, not necessarily, you know, their characteristics. So we work with them about the build up and how they got to that scenario, and we look a lot at their sort of emotional management and their belief systems and things as well. Yeah, but we always look at the context.
Yeah, and when you say you work with them, do you work in a group context? Tell us about the actual intervention.
Yeah, so the first session is delivered one-to-one. So we meet the person and we meet them sort of where they're at. So a lot of them have, like I say, a backstory. Some of them have trauma or life stories. A lot of them have had real tricky situations, like maybe bereavements. There was one chap I was working with recently who had just lost his mum and he was finding it really difficult, and he had an ongoing dispute with his neighbour, and all the emotions came out, you know, in the wrong way and in a really inappropriate way. So the first session is one-to-one, and in that session we find out a bit about the context about themselves, them as a person. We look at their belief systems, also their offence situation, and what they want to gain, what they want for their future. So it's really tailored to the person in front of us. And then we have 3 group sessions. The first group session, we know them all then, we've met them all one-to-one, we know a bit about them. So there's not a real pressure, especially in that first session, for them to have a lot of personal disclosure, but we talk very generally about things in that first session. So we've talked very generally about hate crime, some statistics, a lot about belief systems, entrenched views. We look a lot at, you know, the sort of cognitive behaviour stuff, thoughts, feelings, actions, how they all link together. And we focus a lot on accountability in that first session, and hate crime, exploring a lot about what it is, why their offence falls under hate crime rather than anything else. The second group session is a whole session on emotional management. So we don't really talk about hate crime so much, but it's all about not like anger management, but how anger is usually the result of all these other emotions. So it could be things like their trauma, their frustration, their grief, their bereavement, you know, all of these different things that they're not managing. A lot of them have the relationship breakups and they're going through house moves or really difficult situations, and how not dealing with those emotions often leads to an outcome of anger, and the anger is like the behavior. So we focus a lot on emotional management techniques, emotional awareness. So that's a whole session which focuses on them as individuals, their emotions, how they deal with things, and sort of situations and strategies that work for them. So again, that's very personalized, although that's done as a group, and they do learn a lot from each other as well. And then the last session, it's actually one of my favorites. It's really enjoyable to deliver. We focus a lot on alternative worldviews. So there's a lot about sort of propaganda, the media, things that we absorb, social media. There's some victim impact videos in there. We ask, you know, we talk about stereotypes and, you know, different news reports. Yeah, it's a really eye-opening session, even for those of us which feel we're really open-minded, we don't have any prejudiced views, we talk about unconscious biases. And when you go through this session, you actually go, oh, wow, I wasn't aware that I was being so exposed to all this stuff. And actually, I might have some unconscious actions or biases that are coming through as a result of some of this. And we really talk about that as well, and the impact that has on people. And then we end up talking about restorative justice. We've linked with the restorative justice partners in the different areas. We talk a bit about the services they can provide there and if they want that. service, and then focus on their future and how they're going to make positive changes and what can they do in these difficult situations, again, if they're feeling, whatever their situation was, and we get them to focus on that. And we also look at the consequences for themselves if they get in trouble as well, and not just the community and other people, because sometimes we have to tap into their own ego too, and we say, listen, it's not going to be good for you or your family if you commit an offence again. What would be the impact? So we get them to look at the consequences in lots of different ways, in terms of society, other people, their work, but also themselves as well. So it's 4 sessions, the first one 1-to-1, and it's really positive. We don't shame throughout it. We're really just working with them and sort of moving alongside them throughout it, and getting them to slowly realise all these different elements that contributed to their offending.
And can I remind people that the alternative to this quite sophisticated intervention is that they go to court, and if they are found guilty, they get a fine, a financial fine. Just to round up, can you give us one example of a person and their scenario and what happened to them through the intervention?
Yeah. I was thinking of earlier, because I know I was probably going to get asked that, and I was thinking of which one should I choose, because we've got so many, but some of them are quite similar. But I was working with a guy recently whose wife was a probation officer, and he was up until that point a law-abiding citizen. He'd never done anything. He was in his early 60s. He had children, grown-up children, grandchildren, and he was probably he was doing all right for himself. He had an average sort of family life, and he had a good career, and he had booked tickets to go and see like a Black Sabbath type 70s rock band revival concert, and he took his son with him, his grown-up son, and he was trying to show off to his son. He had some drinks, and he was getting a bit drunk, and he said he got caught in that moment. He got drunk, and he started to try and relive his youth and start a mosh pit or something, and he was so embarrassed. He's like, I'm in my 60s, what was I doing? I was trying to start a mosh pit, but everybody around me was like, pack it in, what you're doing. And then security dragged him over, but they were rough, and they broke some of his ribs, and when he was trying to get away from them, and he was like, I lost, my son was watching me, it was humiliating, everybody in the crowd could see me, and had these security guards, and they wouldn't listen to me, and then they called the police, and he says, and in the moment, he was calling them all sorts. He was racist to one of them, although he says he didn't see anyone of any different race. He was just throwing insults around. And then when they took him to the police station and he'd sobered up, he's horrified with what he did. And he said he's the sort of person which he would judge for doing this. And, his wife's like shaking her head and rolling her eyes like, I'm a probation officer, what are you doing? You're an idiot. And he was there saying to himself, I don't know where that came from or why I did it. But we spoke a lot about his build-up and the stuff that he was going through in his life, and trying to impress, the peer pressure, trying to impress his son and relive his youth, and get all this stuff out of the system, all his frustrations that he had for the last few months, where he'd had a lot of stuff going on. And he was really able to self-reflect on how he got in that scenario. We get a lot of youngsters that are in pubs and bars as well, and we talk to them, and again, they just have some drinks, they're trying to show off, and the bouncers trying to throw them out the club, and again, a lot of it's about ego and showing off in front of their friends, and or trying to just be nasty on purpose in that moment, because they can't physically assault the person, so they're trying to verbally assault them instead. But yeah, they're just the most sort of common. There's a couple that come to my mind.
That's great, Elaine. We must move on to questions.
No worries. I've got hundreds of stories.
So I'm going to hand back to Fionnuala. Thanks very much indeed.
Cheers, no worries.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Penelope. We're going to move to questions now. Do keep adding questions via the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can. Just to say, we might try and come to some people to ask them themselves. It involves some unmuting, so if you're up for that, please do. Courtney's just adding our speakers back in. I'll just kick us off with a few questions that we've had through already. Sarah, there's a couple for you, and one in particular about eligibility, how you decide who's eligible for this assault and emergency worker course, and particularly is an admission required?
So we work differently. Our deferred prosecution scheme does require an admission of guilt or an acceptance of responsibility, or no comment interviews where the evidence is irrefutable should it proceed to court. But the eligibility criteria is applied by the evidence review officers, and then it comes through to our team. So if they have committed an AEW that is deemed suitable for out of court resolution, then the expectation would be on the basis of the needs, risk and strength-based assessment, strength-based being really important as well, because these are monitored throughout the course of the 4 months. So the change is monitored and we can see that visibly, and that's really important for the person as well to see that. Then the conditions are created, one of which is the mandatory attendance at the AEW group work, albeit obviously taking into account EDHR considerations. So, for example, if somebody can't go into that setting, then we would obviously look to work around that. But it's a whole set of conditions, and usually with AEWs as well, which is a big plus for the officers, the swiftness of it. For compensation, for example, and setting up compensation is something which is really pertinent, alongside all the things that Elaine mentioned, the other underlying factors that might have led to those circumstances, whether that be a trauma response, whether that be a substance misuse, etc.
Thank you, Sarah. So I've got a few questions for you, Ailsa. One also about how you decide who's eligible for the course, but I was going to bring in Kirsty, who asked a specific question. Kirsty, you might be hopefully unmuted and able to speak. Let's see
hi
if
there.
you can. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was I'm head of policy.
I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Fionnuala, I'd come in with another question, then we can go back to her.
Yeah, sorry, Kirsty, we'll try and come back to you in a moment. Let me return to the chat. We'll stay with you, Ailsa. Let me see what else we had here.
What
might
about
just
the
have to ask you.
eligibility issue?
Yeah, can you just say a little bit more about the how you decide who's eligible? Thanks, Ailsa.
So we actually have a sort of a positive thing in Surrey. So if somebody is eligible, they have to be referred. And so basically we take most offences as long as it's not indictable only. Doesn't mean to say that we necessarily take them, because we'll obviously go through the joint decision making panel to make sure that it's the risk and everything is suitable, but we will take them for any offences.
Thanks, Ailsa. Do we have Kirsty?
Yes, I'm back. I'm not sure what happened. Yeah, I'm head of policy for the charity Birth Companion, so we focus on working with women who have contact with the criminal justice system in pregnancy and early motherhood, and I was just wondering whether there's any particular observations from the schemes that you've outlined about the benefits of maybe these kinds of approaches for women during pregnancy or the first year or two after giving birth, when they've got very young dependent children.
I've certainly heard when we go in the joint decision making panel, when we speak to liaison diversion and adult social care, that they're women that have got postnatal depression, and actually that's contributed towards possibly the offence, and so we give them specific. We have the ability to be able to refer to our liaison diversion, and we can do a joint needs assessment with them, and obviously they know about specific support that is available for them, and so we can use that.
Thanks, Ailsa.
And just to add in on a general point, deferred prosecution for female offenders is vitally important, I think. We've got so much rich kind of case studies and data around the impact of being able to have that opportunity to be really listened to explore some of the really underlying causes of why they're coming into contact with criminal justice system, and to make sure that it doesn't escalate. And you look at, we followed up people who went to court. So women, for example, who'd gone to court with multiple complex needs, often really vulnerable in terms of some of the relationships they were having with perpetrators, etc. And they were coming out, with a fine and a conditional discharge with no actual holistic kind of reasoning or support. I mean, it's kind of you know, definition of madness, really, because they would be back in front of the court again. So, you know, certainly for females, and I know Ailsa sees this all the time, it's something which we think is really, really important.
I don't know about you, Sarah, but we see a lot of women offenders for assault emergency workers that were in trauma, in a, you know, they've been called for mental health breakdown. We'd arrived because they, you know, lost it a bit. They assault one of our officers and suddenly they're in front of us, which is when we use Elaine's course.
Absolutely. And when often they are in that trauma, the response, because the officers are trying to contain, is to put more and more officers on.
Yeah.
And the reality is that often male officers, and then you see this escalation of the trauma
response. And they trigger
response.
them because of the previous trauma, and yes.
Yeah, it escalates, it adds to the trauma. We hear that all the time. Yeah.
Elaine, we have a question for you. With regard to the hate crime pilot, this is from Frank Atkin. Has the evaluation been published and available? And also, are the cases referred following authorisation from CPS?
I believe it's been published because it's had an extension.
Can I say it's on our blog, on our website?
It's on the blog.
I'll put a link in. Yeah.
There we are. That's answered that one then. So that was easy for me. Thanks for it's published. But it's on their blog, and the extension, the pilot has been extended in those forces as well. So hopefully we'll have some more evidence soon as well to back that up.
But we also, just to say, we use it as part of Checkpoint. So we use the hate crime intervention.
And in terms of the cases being referred following authorisation from the CPS, how does that work?
I think they all have to have authorisation from the CPS, and I know the police deal with a lot of that. So if I'm looking vague, it's because that's the sort of stage before it gets to me. We get the referrals from the police. It's already gone through quite a rigorous process before it gets to us. But I think that was part of at the beginning of the part of a lot of the hesitations, because I think all of the cases had to come through via approval from the CPS. Certainly in the early days.
We've had a question come through on the chat, I think from Eddie Kane, thanks Eddie, which is one of the issues that came up frequently in the research that Eddie did on out-of-court resolutions for the Ministry of Justice, was the negative impact or excluding impact of requiring someone to admit guilt, and the impact on some individuals and communities. Any comments from speakers on that?
All I would say is that when we do the needs assessment, we go through the actual offence and we discuss it. So we don't get any, obviously we wouldn't take it if they said they didn't do it, and they might put up some mitigating factors, but it is discussed, and they understand why they're doing what they're doing.
And I would say as well, part of the process that Ailsa's just described is often you will get people who might say, well, it was me, but... And actually, this is a process. This is brief interventions and engagement over 16 weeks. So you are constantly moving that kind of understanding and self-awareness and accountability, but with compassion through that process. And I'd just like to come in around it, you know, that we've almost got ourselves into a situation where these crimes, we can't look at these crimes, these aren't suitable. And we, you know, this won't be taken seriously. It's the court process that takes it seriously. When we've almost got a situation where the evidence is building and building constantly about this is more effective at reducing harm, so why wouldn't we do it? Then we've got the actual anecdotal from people and individuals who've gone through it, and Ailsa and Elaine's fantastic, you know, reducing reoffending figures as well. And we know that actually to change things, you have to have conversations with people. That's what we do always in our personal lives. So why are we not accepting that there should be that early intervention and a nuanced different response? And I think that's where the strength of this and the flexibility and all the kind of work we're doing, whether it's hate crime, females, assault and emergency workers, look at the evidence. Should anything really be off bounds if you actually get better outcomes for victims and offenders through this vehicle? And that's the question I think we need to ask ourselves.
We've got a question We've got a question that's come through from Anya. Anya, you should be able to ask it yourself if you're able to unmute yourself, which relates to what you were just talking about, Sarah. Are you there, Anya?
Yeah. Hi.
Go for it. Thank you.
I think these are really interesting as examples of specialist best practice for different offences that people may commit. I was wondering the panel's opinion on out of court resolutions use more in general for sort of more, because I think most of the pilots that we have had outside of these instances have been looking at pretty much only summary and some either way. So how would you feel about it being rolled out more generally with less of the nuance that you guys bring to the table?
I'm happy to start. We will take anything that's not indictable only, basically, because the risk and the harm is just too high to take indictable onlys, and I wouldn't want to change that. There is a place for court and there is a place for prison for our risky people who are in our communities causing real risk to others, but everything else I think is basically on the table.
And exactly the same. We follow exactly the same as Ailsa, so we'll take anything, and you still see the same impact around it, because it's not so much the offence as the skill of the key workers or commissioned service or whatever to take in the bespoke nature of what you're dealing with in terms of that person in front of you and what are the needs, and then morphing the contracts to support both, rehabilitation, but also reparation, restorative practice, and indeed restrictive when that's appropriate. So you morph according to the person, to the offence, but nothing's really off the table in that respect.
Yeah, I think I come from a slightly different angle because we don't make the decisions of who gets the course, but we are always very supportive. We believe we work with the person, exactly like you're saying. So we work with the person and we work with what they bring. We use a trauma-informed, person-centred sort of approach, and we've got the content and the skills around, obviously taking into account risk, and they should be. That should be assessed beforehand anyway. But if they've got a conditional caution or an out of court resolution, we do have a deferred prosecution scheme, which we work with in one force area for young people to take on the issues of sort of disproportionality and things. And it works really well because we're working with the person in front of us and the situations that they're in. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got a question here which is relating to assault emergency worker. Elaine, I know RISE does that too, so you might also want to weigh in, but I'll come to Sarah first. Is there any adjusted work done with people with learning disabilities or autism, Sarah?
Yeah, exactly. So we would adjust accordingly, and that's where, again, the key worker model is really important. So we've had people with profound autism, Down syndrome, we do social stories, we work with clinical specialists. So this is about, the role of the key worker, and the same as the navigator in Ailsa's world, is about identifying who's already involved, who are the kind of other services and people that might be taking lead professional role. Is there a multi-agency response that's required? And then adapting according to who are the people already involved in it, adapting in terms of the differentiation of how you are delivering a brief intervention, what are the resources you're using, who is the best person to be delivering that in partnership. And so we would always take account of that and not force somebody into a group situation which isn't appropriate, but always making sure we adapt. So that can be through delivering it ourselves, through getting the suitable partner to deliver the resources, but being present through that. There's lots of ways we will adapt. Everything we do is bespoke to the individual and to their needs.
Yeah.
Anything you wanted to add there, Elaine?
Yeah, I think ours would be very similar. We've actually changed our sort of emergency worker course to a one-to-one course anyway, for lots of reasons, although the group work was fantastic. But just because of the time, I think there was a lot of time limits on it. If we ideally we'd have a course that went on for multiple sessions, and we weren't able to do that. With the police forces weren't able to pay for that either. So we do ours one-to-one, but we often have support workers with us. They might have an appropriate adult with them even, or translators. They might have key workers or an adult parent or something with them. So we'll adapt, and the material is very easy to adapt and meet at the level of the person in front. So exactly. Other than that, exactly the same as Sarah, except for ours is delivered on a one-to-one anyway.
Elaine. Last question, I think, which I'm going to combine into two and bring to you, Ailsa. I've had a couple of questions about either people with multiple offences or with a criminal record, and firstly, how you approach that in terms of, you know, considering whether they're eligible for checkpoint, and in the intervention itself and how that's taken into account.
So the general checkpoint has a maximum previous convictions of, I think it's 2 or 3. However, all women fall into the checkpoint plus, so they can have 16, 17 offences, and we get women with that many offences that we work with. And you'll find that they'll have gone to court, and as you say, they'll have got a fine, they've got a conditional discharge. Nobody's actually worked with them, nobody's actually listened to them. And going on from what Sarah was saying, a lot of the emails and letters that we get is somebody's actually listened to me and understood why, you know, they might come to us with they're always drunk, they're alcoholic. Well, actually, no, it's because of the trauma, and you deal with the trauma, then you can deal with the drink, and then you can, you know, and then they get the kids back, then they can get a job and that sort of thing. So I've forgotten the original question, but I think I've kind of answered it.
I think you did. Yeah, it was eligibility and how you deal with that. Thanks very much. Right, we are coming up close to 2 p.m, so we had better wrap up now. Thank you to our speakers for joining us. It's been brilliant to have your input, and to all attendees and for your questions. Courtney has posted in the chat a link to our crime resolution tracker and our out of court resolutions publications page, which has lots of resources. Go on and have a look at how your police force does in terms of using out of court resolutions versus charge. Thanks very much. We'll be following up with any links and slides that we're able to share afterwards.
Thank you.
Goodbye and enjoy your Thursday.
Cheers, bye.